Hello and welcome to video number 8. In this video, we will be assigning materials to our two-way radio. We're going to create a little studio scene and render out some nice product shots, and I'll wrap up with a little chat about exporting your model for 3D printing. It's really easy. Creating that final rendered image or video is often an important final step of a design project. Whenever you choose to start the process of assigning and creating materials, you will be spending the majority of your time here within the Render tab. Before we jump in, how about we take a little tour of this workspace? On the right, you can see the familiar items list, and beneath it is the shader tree. This will be your main tool during this part of the process. Just to the right of the shader tree is the Properties panel, only in here it has been given more real estate as there are more properties to manage within the Render tab. On the left, there are two viewports. The bottom half is a regular 3D viewport. The bottom viewport also has tabs that lead to a few other useful spaces. You've already used the schematic editor in the last video, and in this video, we will be using the Render preset browser and the gradient editor. If you peek into the Render preset browser, you'll see Modo comes equipped with a fantastic library of preset materials to choose from. There are many options for all standards of consumer product materials that you might require, such as plastics and metals, rubber, glass, wood, concrete, stone, leather, and so on. Using these presets is a great place to start if you want to start learning how to make your own materials from scratch. Above the 3D viewport is the Render preview window that comes in paused, and when you hit play, the render will start to cook. That is, it will start to inch towards a more resolved resolution, and you can see its progress in the little bar down here. Let's talk about the elements within the shader tree, starting with the material group, which is this little green sphere with a red dot. Material groups can be thought of as containers that hold any of the various shader tree items, such as shaders, materials, textures, and render outputs. These containers can be useful for simply organizing the shader tree, but they are incredibly powerful beyond that. When you assign a material to a set of polygons, a material group containing a material, which is this little green sphere, is automatically added to the shader tree, and once created, changes made to the various layers under the material group will only affect the polygons with that material assignment or polygon tag. But if you want another way of thinking about it, shader tree items actually affect the entire scene until they're limited to specific areas of your objects by way of a mask. And that mask are your material assignments or polygon tags. The material itself contains all the properties that you'll need to produce a rendered surface, and there are a lot of properties to manage. But the two main groups that you'll want to familiarize yourself with are the Material Ref tab, which is short for Material Reflected. So all the attributes that impact how much light is reflected from your surface, such as diffuse and specular, can be found here. Then there is the Material Trans, short for transmissive, which controls how much light is transmitted through your surfaces. So if you're making any glass, transparent, or translucent surfaces, you want to get in here and start tweaking parameters. There's a lot more to go on about, but enough of that. Let's start adding materials to our radio. As always, I'll start by saving our file down. This file will be in the Video 8 content folder, and I'll version up. As I mentioned earlier, to set a material for any part, you have to assign it to a material tag. To do this, you could either select the item layer or individual polygons and hit M for material. So grab the front part, the hatch door, and the back final and hit M for material. This will bring up a material assignment dialog box with a few options, and I usually just give my material a name and make a color choice at this stage and leave everything else as it is. So let's call this Body Shader. And I'll click this color swatch, which will bring up the OS color picker, which I'm not a big fan of, so I usually don't make any precise color choices from here. So I'll just OK this color and hit OK here. You can access the shader tree from the Model tab, and it's located just up here beside the Items tab. And you can see that the material group and a material have been added to our scene. And from here, if you click this color swatch, this will bring up the Modo color picker, which I prefer a lot more. So here you can Here you can see a material group and a material have been added to the scene. Here you can see a material group and a material have been added to our scene. Click on the material and then click on this color swatch for the diffuse color, and this will bring up the Modo color picker, which I prefer a lot more. We have a color wheel, we have different ways of inputting color information, and we can save these color chips down here to this browser. So I'm going to set the color for our body to a value of 0.2, and I have a lot of different grays saved here because as a product designer, I use this color a lot. All right, open up the buttons group locator. Let's grab the push to talk button and I'll hit M for material and I'll call this PTT shader. And I'm actually going to use the OS color picker this time because I want this bright green, and I'll add it to my custom colors and select it, click OK. And there we go. I'll grab the volume slider and hit M for material and call this volume shader. If you hold shift and drag over the color swatch, it'll change all three RGB values at once. So it's easy to make changes on a value scale using this method. So I'm just going to make this a little bit lighter gray than the rest of the body. All right, grab the power button and M for material, I'll call this power button shader, and I'll leave the color the same. M for material, channel switch shader. M for material, antenna shader. For the antenna, I'd like to add a little bit of a color splash around these little inset striped areas. So I'll pop into Polygons mode and I'll select two adjacent polygons from the striped areas, hit L for loop, shift up to expand my selection, and then I'll call this antenna stripe shader. And I'll go grab that bright green again. Let's add a shader for the ports panel. Ports shader. And this I want to be rather dark. Okay, for the LED light, we'll grab these central polygons, shift up to expand our selection, and we'll call this LED. We'll grab that bright green again, hit OK, and then hit open bracket to reverse the selection, and then we'll just call this LED shader. All right, I'd like to add a little bit more geo to this screen. As it stands, I don't think it's going to render very nicely, so I'll hide the rest of the geometry for now and pop back into face mode. Let's grab these edges here, and let's actually fill in the back of this with polygons. So I'll pop into the duplicate tab and just bridge this. Make sure that auto connection is turned on. And I'll grab these polygons and I'm going to move them forward just a little bit and add some supporting geometry to the back. Spacebar to drop the tool. I'll add an extra edge loop just right here. Now I'm going to Control-C, Control-V, and paste a copy of these and move them just a little bit further back. All right, I'll hit Shift-H to hide the other polygons for now. And I'll add another loop about here and another one here. So I'll grab these polygons, Shift-G, and turn off snapping, and I'll bevel these in just a little bit, and then Shift-click, I'll make another bevel inwards. Shift-click, I'll do one more just to inset this to support it. Spacebar to drop the tool, and let's just add that last little bit of supporting geometry in here. And let's see, I'll move these polygons out so that we don't have any intersecting geometry. All right, that looks fine. So select these polygons, M for material, and call this screen back shader. And I'm going to give this, I'll wait to give this a color, and then I'll unhide the other polygons, and I'll call these polygons screen shader. Let's smooth everything and unhide. I'm not too worried about that intersecting bit of geo from the screen behind this. It won't show in our render. All right, the last thing we're going to have to do is add another blocker behind these speaker holes, much like we did for this ports panel. Go into the buttons group locator, hit N to make a new mesh layer, and let's call this speaker mesh blocker. And I'll go into a front view, and I'll select that mesh item layer and the front part panel and shift hide so that we just have those two items showing. So in our blocker layer, I'll go to the basic toolbox, and I'm just going to draw out a simple polygon here. If you right click and drag, you can add some more subdivisions to our polygons, which, let's see, I don't want any divisions going in that direction. If you right click and drag upwards, you can further subdivide your polygon, which you might want to do as we are going to be using a mesh constraint to stick this to the back of the speaker mesh. So I'll hit spacebar to drop the tool. However, I want to take these edges and tuck them behind the actual geometry of the speaker mesh, because these will poke through when we try to use a mesh constraint. Okay, that looks fine. I'll pop into a perspective mode, and I'm just going to move these back so they're clear out of the way first. And then I'll activate a mesh constraint, a background constraint, and the geometry constraint is set to vector. Okay, W for move, and let's just stick these to the back. Spacebar to drop the tool. Make sure you drop your background constraint. All right, let's unhide everything else. And I'm going to grab the blocker layer and our older blocker layer from the ports panel. And let's call those both blocker shader. And I'm going to make these black, and I'll have 0 specularity on these. Okay, at this point, I'm going to version up. So I'll go to File, Save Incremental. And this will automatically version up my save number to a version 7. The next thing we're going to do is build a little set for our two-way radio. So make a new mesh item layer. Come to a top view, activate the cube primitive, and let's set our segments to 3. And then holding Control, just click and drag out a cube about that big. And like so. And I'm going to delete these polygons. And then I'll hit F for flip, and then I'll smooth the edges, and this will act as our little set stage here. I think I'll actually make this a little bit bigger along this plane. Now let's give it a material tag, so we'll call this set shader, and I'll make it about that dark. Click OK. And let's call our set. And if you'd like, you can group this with the directional light in the camera and call it studio, because that's what it is. All right, let's also grab the buttons and all of the parts of our radio, and we'll group these in a group locator that we'll call TWR for two-way radio. And then right click on this and go to duplicate instance hierarchy. And if you go into the transform tools for this new copy here that you can see is italicized, we'll turn it around 180 degrees, and making sure that you only have the top level of this selected, let's just move it over a little bit about here. So this is just an instance of our actual radio. So any changes that we make to the geometry of the original two-way radio will be updated and reflected here. So this isn't actually real geometry. You can't select any of the edges or the polygons. It's just referencing this original piece of geometry. I'm also going to just turn these a little bit, about 5 degrees on both of these, so 185 degrees. And let's pop over to the layout tab to set up our camera and our lights. So right now our camera is pretty far away, and it's also pretty huge. So let me first just move this closer to the item so you can see just how big it is. And that's a little bit difficult to manage. So if you pop into the display submenu within the camera, you can change the size to 0. And that's certainly a lot better. Every new Modo scene comes with a default directional light, but I find this light to be a little harsh. So we're going to delete it, yes, and yes to all. And let's add an area light instead. And this area light is going to come in way too big. So first let's just turn it negative 90 degrees. And you can use these scale handles here to make the light smaller. It's a lot better to scale your light using these scale handles as opposed to actually just scaling it, which will change the transform parameters here. Try to make a habit of using these tool handles when you scale your lights. All right, let's duplicate this light. Control D to duplicate it in items mode. And let's set an origin action center. And then we can just rotate our extra light all the way around the scene. And I'm going to bring this a lot closer. I'm also going to move my radios so that they sort of straddle the origin. So I'll select both of the group locators and I'll just release my action center here and I'll move them from a top view to about there. And now I can grab both the area lights and reposition them. I'm setting them slightly behind the actual geometry because I want them to act more like rim lights. But this will take some fine-tuning in the render tab to get right. But this will take some fine-tuning no matter what within the render tab to get it right. All right, next step is our camera. So set the action center to origin again. And let's rotate the camera on the y-axis so that it's pointing directly at the cameras. Let's move those lights into the studio where they belong. And let's just pop into a camera view to see what we've got here. That looks pretty good, but I'm going to zoom in a little bit. So I'll set my action center to local and then just dolly inwards like so. All right, that's too much. All right, save the scene. And I'm going to actually place one more area light. And let's scale it down drastically. So we're creating a set that's a dark color and we have a product that's also a dark color. So we're going to need to create some form of contrast in order to make our product visible and make an appealing final image. So what I'm doing is placing an area light so that it illuminates the ground behind our subjects here. That'll create a little bit of contrast that'll help pull the radios away from the background. Spacebar to drop the tool. All right, let's pop over into the render tab and see what we've got so far. So we're going to have to do a lot of fine tuning here. To start, I'm going to open up the material group for the set shader, and I'm going to bring the Fresnel down to 50%. And I think I'll make it a little bit darker in here as well. I'm not a huge fan of the way the light is bouncing off of my set here, so I'm going to make a few adjustments. So I can pop into a perspective mode here and grab these area lights, which I think are the culprits, and I'm just going to make them smaller and maybe bring them forward a little bit more. And you can see that's lighting the side of the radio quite nicely. And I'm getting a nice highlight from this one on the side of the radio. And I even like the bit of light that's catching the side of the back here that's really pulling it away from the background. With my third area light, the floor fill area light selected, I'm going to increase the radiance to about 5. I want that a little bit brighter just down here. All right, let's just make our way down here. I've got the blocker shader. I'm going to set the Fresnel for this down as well. And the roughness can stay as is. Maybe not full black. All right, that's a little bit better. All right, let's take our screen shaders and we'll group them into their own material group, and let's call this group Screen Group. And now let's pop into the render preset browser and let's see what we have for options here. So if you just open this for the first time, you'll probably be around here. So if you go into the glass folder, I'm just going to grab the glass crown simply, and there's a few ways that I can add this to the scene. I can click and drag it into render preview, and you can see that it'll highlight where it will assign this material. And if you have material tags, it'll try to assign it to each of those material tags. If there aren't any material tags, then you'll just end up assigning this material to everything. You can also just drag and drop this into the shader tree. So I'm going to do that with the screen shader. And now it's picking up a nice reflection from that area light. But I want to go a little bit further. I'm going to grab the screen back shader and change the color of this to kind of a greenish blue color, maybe a little bit more blue. Yeah, something like that, and maybe I'll decrease the Fresnel. I kind of want it in the background and out of the way. I don't really want it to stand out very much, so let's grab the LED and I'll pop into the material trans, and I'm going to set a luminosity value of 3, and here we can set the color, and I'll go for that bright green again. And you can see now that this is actually a light that's illuminating. It's very different than the push to talk button, which is also very similar bright green. And let's pop into the push to talk shader, go to the material ref, and I want to increase the specularity of this to about 20. Because I want it to be a little bit shinier. Let's bring down the roughness to 20 as well. And it'll start to pick up, the light will start to pick up off of that inset that we created on this, which gives it a little bit more definition, maybe 25. It's definitely starting to stand out a little bit better. Let's see, I want that volume shader to be a little bit lighter. Yeah, even just that, that's fine. All right, let's explore what other materials we can use from the render preset browser. So I'm going to go into the plastics folder, Let's apply a black plastic mat. Let's apply a black plastic mat to the body of our radio. So I'm just going to grab this and drag it into the body shader. And that'll drop a new material group into the material group that we originally created. And in here, you'll find a bump and a material shader. This bump is, well, a bump is a way of adding a bit of three-dimensional texture to a surface without any extra added geometry. And we need to size our bump. So I'm going to just hit auto size for this. That'll do a good enough job for now. And you can set the height of your bump in the material ref parameter. So I'll go down here to bump amplitude, and that's really small. So I'm just going to stick with that. And I just like the look of this matte, softer black. I think it looks a lot better. I'm going to use this black clear coat on some of the other elements in the scene, like the port shader. So this time I'll grab this and drop it onto the port shader itself. And if you right-click on the render preview, it'll direct you to the proper material group. And you can see that I've applied the black plastic clear coat to the back set and not the ports shader. So let's go up to the set shader, and you can see that it is in the wrong material group, and I can just click and drag this and drop it into the ports shader. Open this up, and this has a bump as well, which will resize. And I'm going to use the same shiny material for the channel switch. And I'm going to use the same black plastic clear coat material for the channel switch. So I'll just select that. All right, it doesn't want to select. It's right here. So I'll just drag and drop this in. And for the power button, I like that matte black, so I'll use that for the button shader. Toss another clear-coated black plastic into the antenna shader, but we're going to tweak this a little bit by hand. So open this up, go into the black plastic clear coat, make sure that you resize that bump, and then select the material itself. Right now it's using a refractive index to drive the specularity. I'm going to turn that off, and I'm going to increase the roughness of this, because right now you can see that it's really creating these quite harsh reflections on the surface of this, and I don't think that it matches the rest of the radio. So I'm going to tone some of these things down a bit, starting with the roughness. So I'm going to increase the roughness to 40%, and I'm also going to decrease the clear coat amount, which is currently set at 100, which is just too much for me. So I'm going to bring this all the way down to 20. And clear coat acts basically just like a varnish. So you could have a rather rough surface with a very shiny clear coat amount. All right, let's make this a little bit lighter. And maybe I'll increase the specularity to 15. No, I think I like that better the other way. You can really spend a lot of time in here playing and tweaking with different values within the shader tree, and I won't spend too much longer in here, but I do want to make another change to the lights. Lights can often look rather CG in these settings, so I'm going to add an extra element to bring a little bit more color and life into our render. Pop back over into the Layout tab, and I'll grab this floor fill light and I'll call it floor fill so I don't get confused. And I'll grab our first area light, go into the shader tree and go down to the light section and I'll close the floor fill. We don't need that. And I'll grab this area light. I'll go to add layer and I'm going to go to processing and I'll add a gradient. And this will bring in this big box in the screen. This is a texture locator. Quite often I keep them turned off because they're rather distracting, but when I need to use them, I just come here to turn them on. So you can hit O on your keyboard to bring up this menu. Head back to the item list and you can see that we have this new folder called texture group, and there are folders for each of the materials that we dragged in from the preset browser. But they're empty folders, and they're empty because the texture locators that belong within them are being filtered out of the item tree. So now we can grab the gradient texture locator for this gradient that we just added to the lights. Here it is. So we want to parent this to the area light. So the first area light that we made, we can drag and drop it, but when you drag and drop, make sure that you hold Control, and that'll snap the texture locator to the location of the light. The next thing we need to know is how big this light is. If you activate the Move tool by hitting W and you don't see any information about the light, that means that you don't have advanced tool handles turned on. And I don't have them turned on, so let's turn them on together. So let's go to Systems and go to Preferences and go to Tool Handles, and under Selected Tool Handles, just switch this to Advanced. Now, when we go to move the light, you can see that we have, and it's a little bit hard to see, but you can see that we have a value for how big this light is. All right, let's just add another gradient to the other area light. And we'll grab its texture locator and do the exact same thing. And we'll parent it to the light on the opposite side. So holding Control and drop it into place. And then head back to the shader tree and let's grab that first gradient. So gradients do a lot of things and they can be difficult to wrap your head around at first, but just bear with me and gradients will sort of make more sense over time the more you use them. So we're going to set the input parameter, and there's a lot of options for input parameters, but we're going to use a distance to locator parameter. And our gradient at the moment, if you look within the shader tree, is affecting the light color. And we're going to attenuate that with a gradient, a color gradient. So in this area here, you can select this triangle and click Open in Editor, and that'll bring up the gradient editor. And you can see that we have an RGB value selected here. And we've got this little keyframe at 0 millimeters. Let's zoom in. You can use the same navigational tools as you can in the 3D viewport. And we said that light was, I think it was 73 millimeters across. Let's select it, double check. Yeah, 73 millimeters. So let me just grab that gradient again. And I'll zoom in till I can see those values. And then I'll middle mouse click on the graph here to create another keyframe. And I'll set this keyframe at about 73 millimeters approximately. And I'll set its value to be a lot darker. Not black, but much darker. And then I'll create another keyframe just sort of beside it. And I'll make this a warmer, brighter color. And I'll show you what this does in a moment here. So I'll leave that. Let's close the gradient editor. We've got a lot going on in this scene here. I'm actually going to hide my texture locators. There, that's a lot better. Let's pop back into the render tab and have a look at the results. So these sort of changes are subtle, but we're at the stage where we're looking for subtle improvements. And if you can't see exactly what this is doing, then we can really bump up these values to show them off a little bit more prominently, just temporarily. So I'll grab this keyframe and let's just set this to a bright, like a hot pink color. And you can see that it's washing the side of this radio and a little bit over here. And if we were to grab this color and give it another bright color as well, you can see that it's not It's not quite, it's not terribly obvious, but it's starting to come in a little bit here, and we might want to pull this in a little bit more so it becomes a little bit more obvious. So we can just get a bit of variety in the color that's washing the side of this. So I'm going to bring these back to more reasonable colors, although you might want to go with a stylistic lighting setup like this. But I'm going to bring this back down. And I'll also increase the radiance of this so it's a little bit brighter. Okay, let's grab the gradient on the other light and we'll do the same thing. I'm going to set the input parameter to distance to locator. And I'll set a keyframe around here and set this to pretty dark. And I'm also going to make this light a lot brighter as well. You also have some options with the camera here. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but I will give myself a wider lens to work with. I think I'll go with 25 millimeters, and I'll have to zoom in again. And I'll grab my set and grab these edges here, and then I'll just move those up to compensate. Let me just pause the rendering while I do that. It'll make it a little bit faster. I can move these up, and then let's just do that again. All right, I'm going to save. All right, I think I'm pretty happy with this so far. Let's fire off a render. So you can hit this render button up here, or you can hit F9. And my window is much too big here. Let me just scale this in for you. So here's the first bucket render of our radio, and I have to say it looks awful. It's very noisy and the resolution is terrible. But renders take a lot of time, and oftentimes it's really hard to see whether or not the changes you're making are valuable or not. So I'll show you what we're going to do. I know a few settings that we can change right away to make this a lot better. So pop up to the renderer in the render tree and go over to the settings. So noise generally comes from one of a few places, and that is either GI, sampling, or anti-aliasing. So we'll start with anti-aliasing, and I'm going to up the samples all the way up to 512. And I'm going to change the environment shading threshold to 0.1. And I'll also bump up our reflection samples. Increasing these samples and these parameters definitely increases your render time, and you don't want to have to do a whole render of your entire image to see whether or not the changes you made were of any value. So what you can do instead is just do a render region. So let's just pop back into a camera mode here, go to render region tool, and then you can click and drag a small region to render, and then have a look at that to see if you've made any progress. That took a lot less time, and I can zoom in here and check, and you can see that our noise level has improved drastically, but it could definitely improve a little bit more. So I'm going to play around with a few more parameters, and I'll pause the video and come back when I have a result that's a little bit more pleasing. All right, I've rendered out this image, and you can see it's come a long way from our first render. A lot of the noise is gone, and it just looks a lot better. I'll go back to our first image for a comparison. At this point, you can save the image in a number of formats, or you can save a layered image, or save your passes as images if you've created different render outputs for yourself. All right, I'll save down. And then as promised, I'll show you how to output this for 3D printing. So we need to separate some of these elements if we're going to 3D print any of this. So I'll create a new scene by hitting Control-N, and then I'll go back to our radio file, and I'll grab the front part, and I'll just show you how to do the front part, because if you can do the front part, then you can do the rest of them. I'll drag this into the untitled new Modo scene. And then I'll delete everything else in this scene. So we need to export this file as an STL, which you may have guessed. So we'll export as a STL file, and I'll save this in the exports folder as front piece STL. And STL files don't take very long to save. If we go into our content folder, you can see it's there with the exports next to the SAT file that we exported from video 3. Well, this concludes this tutorial series, folks. We've covered a lot of material in a short period of time. I've included a few other items in the content folder, including a Photoshop file that has some basic layers that I added to push the images. I've also added a few more details to the two-way radio, which has been saved into version 07 in the 08 content folder. I sincerely hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and more importantly, I hope you've picked up some new skills along the way. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.